I'm going to give you a bit of a historical overview of immunology and link into that some of the diseases that affect us and potentially affect us, and extend a bit of what Chris mentioned, but also give you an idea of what Garvan Immunology is doing beyond what we've just heard this morning. So, do I do this? Yes. So, when you hear the word, a lot of scientific words, it sounds jargon and often like a foreign language. And for immunology, that's very apt because historically the word immunity comes from the Latin word immunus, which was used many, many, many years ago to describe people who were lucky enough to be exempt from a number of society obligations or impacts which made their life a little bit easier. So in ancient times, these were the examples like military service, having to pay tax, or to do other public service. So those people were described to have immunists. And in the context of modern day immunology, of course, what that refers to is protecting us from the not so good stuff that we have to encounter every day. So from our perspective, of course, as Chris said, the immune system really functions to protect us against infection with a whole bunch of different infectious agents or microbes. And in our case, that some of them are shown here, we've got bacteria, yeast, fungal infections, viruses, parasites, and so on. So the immune system really works to afford us very good health, and it does that by combating the deleterious effect of infection. And we can also harness the immune system to protect us against cancer, and something we've been doing for hundreds of years, of course, is taking advantage of the immune system to protect us against infection by vaccination, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So, again, going back to ancient times, the immune system, while we've been doing great research on it for hundreds of years, it was actually first described thousands of years ago, in fact, before about 500 years BC. And this is a picture of a Greek historian, a Greek philosopher called Thucydides, and he wrote a book which described his experience of this time on the catastrophic effect of some infection, possibly the bubonic plague, during a time of the Peloponnesian Wars in ancient Greek and Athens. And what he noted in his book, or writings at the time, he made this fantastic quote, and this refers to the way people were managed who were really sick with infection. And what he noted was, it was with those who had recovered from the disease, so in other words, those who had already been sick but had gotten better, that the sick and the dying found most compassion. It was because they knew what it was from experience and now had no fear for themselves. For the same man, presumably the same woman as well, the same man was never attacked twice, never at least fatally. So what he's actually describing here is when you get infected for the first time, and if you survive it, you're often protected against that bacteria or that virus for life, or at least for a very long time. So this was a very prescient observation by a Greek historian, which really laid a very critical cornerstone for what we now understand is the way the immune system works. So what do immune cells do? How does our immune system work? So in our blood, but also throughout all of our body, we have different types of immune tissues, and circulating throughout those are blood cells, white blood cells. So you often go to the doctor and you have to have a white blood cell count. What the doctors are looking for are these cells here, your monocytes, your lymphocytes like B cells and T cells, neutrophils, basophils. They all have interesting names which often go to describing them. But these are all leukocytes, and of course there's the red blood cells up here. But this is the driving force of the immune system, and all of these cells have specialized function, but then also work together to solve the problem. A lot like the collaborative efforts that Chris was talking about of how we work to get the job done. So in this case, these cells get activated when we get infected, and it's their job then to go out and prevent infection and pretty much keep infection at bay and clear them from the body by activating particular processes to imprint on our immune system the ability to recognize these foreign invaders and destroy them. So to give you a little bit more detail about the cells of the immune system, just give you some specific real-life examples here. So when you go to the doctor, you're often asked to open your mouth, say, that's not a trivial exercise. What the doctor's looking for is your swollen glands. You have lymph nodes in the back of your neck. The doctors will also feel under your arms because you have lymph nodes under your arms. So if you have infection, you'll have this inflammatory response. And what's going on there is that your immune cells are leaving the blood and entering the sites of infection. So that's why you get swelling, redness, and inflammation. It's the cells leaving the bloodstream and getting into the site of infection. And these cells, B cells, for example, will make antibodies. These are these red proteins, which are secreted by the B cell, and they hone in and target the cell and tag it for destruction. Macrophages, which again is another example of a different language. Macrophage means giant eater. And it does that. It eats up bacteria that it comes across. It knows it shouldn't be there, and it gets activated, and the macrophages have a steady diet of microbes. And then we have other cells of the immune system, which are called killer cells, and that's because that's what they do. They get in there, and they're a bit like the armed forces. They get in there, and they just obliterate the enemy, hopefully, without leaving too much destruction of your own tissues behind. So to put this into context, I just want to show you this graph. This is a fantastic graph that really illustrates the power of the immune system and the importance of the immune system. So this shows the survival over years of different times over the last tens of thousands of years. So back in thousands of years ago, or even 10,000 years ago, or even 150 years ago, in Liverpool in the UK, this was the survival curve. So about 50% of people would die within the first few decades of life. So there's a very good chance if I was talking in 1860, I would not be giving this talk because I may be one of the unlucky 50%. So you can see the lifespan didn't change for thousands of years, literally thousands of years. The survival of 10,000 years ago versus 150 years ago was the same. But now, today, we have this sort of survival curve where many, many people live well beyond 70s and so on. And this is probably out of date now, being nearly 20 years old. This has probably shifted more to the right. So humans haven't evolved in 150 years dramatically to become this sort of super species, which is of great longevity naturally. We haven't evolved a lot of genes which protect us from infection. What has happened has been the implementation of health changes and society's changes, which have allowed extension of this lifespan. And these really impact the immune system. So again, it shows if you treat the immune system right or you work with it, it can really benefit you. So these were pretty simple concepts. It's hard to believe today that people didn't, for example, wash their hands not that long ago. Or, of course, didn't have access to clean water. But improved hygiene had a huge effect on lifespan, as did the introduction of antibiotics. So both of those two really reduced the burden of infection that we were being exposed to. And complementing this, of course, was vaccination, the implementation of vaccination hundreds of years ago, which boosted the immune system and prepared it for being able to respond to infection. And this is a picture of Edward Jenner working with a perhaps not such a volunteer. This is a young boy called James Phipps, who was the son of a milkmaid, who was being exposed to smallpox, who had actually already been vaccinated with cowpox as a protection against smallpox infection. So today we have a whole range of vaccines that can be delivered. Many of these are childhood vaccines. So I have young kids. They have a great childhood vaccination program from birth to 4 years old, and then it keeps going on, of course. But we can get vaccinated against all of these different pathogens because they can cause all sorts of pretty horrible diseases. Infection, of course, but some of these infections can also cause cancer. And a great example of that is the Gardasil vaccine, which protects us actually against human papillomavirus, and it's the virus that causes cancer, which is cervical cancer and other types of cancer. But you can see here that these very common variety diseases we hear about, whooping cough, measles, mumps, rubella, polio, smallpox, have all been controlled to an extent by implementation of fantastic vaccine programs. So not that long ago, this was not an uncommon sight in the 50s due to the polio outbreak. And this is a picture of individuals who were put into an iron lung. They needed assistance breathing because polio is a paralytic infection which really prevented their nervous system from controlling their respiration. So I think we've become a little bit blasé these days about the importance of vaccination because we don't see this anymore. Polio is pretty much eradicated. We don't see these severe outbreaks in many Western countries anyway. And we get a little bit blasé about the importance of vaccination. But I want to put that into some type of numbers. So this is a study from a number of years ago, and what it shows is the number, this is from the US, These are the numbers of people who died every year. So 1 million people, 5 million people who died of different infections. Measles, pertussis, mumps, hepatitis, and so on. This is invasive pneumococcal disease, tetanus. So the black lines are the number of deaths every year in America before the implementation of that vaccine. And you can see the numbers drop off dramatically. So sometimes you went from having like 5 million people dying, down to 10,000, which is still 10,000 too many, but that's a huge reduction. And likewise, these diseases here, polio, smallpox, were pretty much eradicated, going down to single-digit infections per year from thousands, tens of thousands. So again, to think of that in terms of Australia, if you add up all those black bars, the numbers of deaths that used to occur in the US before vaccination was pretty much 7 million people, which is the population of New South Wales. So every year, the population of New South Wales would be wiped out due to infectious disease. Today, it's about the population of Wagga, which is about 50,000 people. So I've gone from 7 million to 50,000 with the addition of those vaccines every time we can prevent an infectious disease. Pretty remarkable. But we're not there yet. There's complacency about current vaccines, but there's also a driving need to be aware of emerging pathogens which need to be controlled, and also very common conditions. So HIV has been a pandemic of the 80s, and of course is still affecting people today, and we don't have a vaccine against it. We hear of exotic viruses like bird flu, swine flu, camel virus flu, you may have heard of, the Mediterranean Eastern flu virus. We don't have vaccines against that, or Ebola. And then there's other diseases which you hear about all the time, malaria, tuberculosis, Epstein-Barr virus even, which cause a lot of deaths and disease, but we can't control them by vaccination. So we need to work on that. So, as Chris mentioned, the immune system can cause a lot of damage to the body if things go wrong. And I just want to highlight that a little bit more to give you a sense of just how broad the immune system is required for function to protect us against all sorts of different conditions. So obviously the main function we think about is infection, and sure enough, if you have a problem with your immune system that it doesn't work, you can have immunodeficiency, where your immune system predisposes you to a lot of infections which most of us just deal with without even knowing we're infected. So these are genetic or acquired diseases, so you can have horrible infections that don't go away. This is a young boy, David Vetter, who you may know colloquially as the boy in the bubble. So he lived pretty much all of his 12 and a half years in a sterile plastic bubble because his immune system pretty much didn't exist. If he was exposed to any bacteria or virus, it was pretty much a death sentence. Luckily today, we don't put kids in bubbles, and we have much better ways of treating these kids. So you can have immunodeficiency. As Chris talked about, autoimmunity, and as Chris said, there's about 100 different autoimmune diseases, and these are some of the more common ones, but there's a laundry list of diseases which are autoimmune, which some of you may have, some of you may have heard about, which goes well beyond these more common ones which affect a greater proportion of individuals. There's also cancer, so lymphoma, leukemia, myeloma. These are all malignancies of those white blood cells that I showed you earlier on. So you can't just get a brain tumour or stomach cancer. Cancer cancer affects every cell type, basically. So you get immune system cancers, and you can also get allergy, of course. So for me, it's cats and dust and pollen. For many other people, it can be all sorts of things, peanuts, bee stings, the works. So there's all sorts of diseases that affect the immune system. So these are all sorts of things we need to think about. And in fact, that's what we do here at Garvan. We have a great landscape of researchers who are doing all really innovative and groundbreaking work to address many of these health burdens that are put on society by a dysfunctioning immune system. So we have people studying different types of autoimmune diseases. We have people looking into how to prevent organ rejection. So that's another way the immune system can get in the way of medicine, is you hear of people having their kidneys rejected if they have a transplant. That's the immune system doing that. My lab and many other colleagues here, we study genetic defects in the immune system. Have groups looking at cancer immunotherapy, so better ways to treat cancer, inflammatory diseases. And we also have a lab who's working up developing drugs to treat other diseases as well, exploiting the immune system. So Garvan is really at the leading edge of basic research, translational research, and clinical research, which runs the gamut of work studying in animal models of disease, real patients with disease, and drug development to really try to advance our basic understanding of science and immunology, but also convert that to better outcomes for everyone. And Australia has a great history in the immunology space. We've had quite a few prominent individuals noted with probably the most prestigious prize, the Nobel Prize. A number of Nobel laureates, going back to Howard Florey for his work in developing antibiotics, Macfarlane Burnet in the 60s, Peter Doherty in the 90s for work he did in the 70s, and Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, who I guess technically are microbiologists, but we'll claim them as immunologists for this point of this. And also, it's not just international awards. Of course, we have fantastic Australians who are recognised as Australians of the Year over the time. And in fact, I think the Australian of the Year prize was developed because Burnet won the Nobel Prize, and suddenly the Australian government thought, crikey, if Stockholm's recognising this guy, we better do something about it as well. So Mac Burnet was the first Australian of the Year in 1960, and we've had this other great list of esteemed immunology colleagues who have been awarded that accolade as well. So Garvan's built on this great foundation of history of immunology in Australia, and is also pushing forward internationally with our efforts to really understand immunology and prevent disease. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you for your attention. And I'm going to hand over to, my talk's finished, so you can just stop that now. That was just backup slides.